Hello, white people. This is an article from Forbes.com dated July 14th, 2022, and the author's name is Dana Brownlee. It's rarely helpful to label someone racist, but not for the reasons you might think, as organizations tackle topics related to race and equity in an unprecedented way because of diversity hires and their incompetence. There's a tacit tension constraining and constricting many of these necessary overdue conversations. Well, meaning you're not supposed to say anything about people's incompetence if they're a diversity hire. Indeed, many white colleagues in particular are deathly afraid of being labeled racist and losing their livelihoods. So instead of engaging, questioning, learning, and contributing, or pretending like you've bought the BS, they largely sit on the sidelines, nervously itching for a topic change. Nervously itching, huh? Much of that discomfort is a result of an anachronistic, fundamentally skewed concept of what Waycism actually looks like and what the term racist really means in 2022. Oh, seriously, really? Oh, okay, let's check this out and see if we can figure it out. Does it mean something different than it meant in 2021? As Equal Justice Initiative founder, not social justice, but equal justice, Brian Stevensonberg reflects, he's probably a Bolshevik too, on the emancipation of affirmative action Americans post-Civil War. He insists slavery doesn't end, it just evolves. What do you mean, slavery of white people and the taxes they have to pay to support all the diversity? Similarly, racism didn't end, it too evolved. With the acknowledgement of this tragic evolution, it's important to recognize that what is considered and meant by the term racist today is very different from what was considered racist in decades or centuries past. Well, to be honest, the word racist didn't even exist in decades or centuries past. This is a brand new Bolshevik word to make people feel guilty and to make them, when they're slaves, you got to browbeat the crap out of them to make them behave. And the conflation of the two oftentimes becomes a stumbling block for productive exchange and real progress. Well, you're not going to get real progress if you can't get people to buy your BS. Indeed, if we're to effectively navigate Waycism 3.0, there's a Waycism 3.0, huh? The post-civil rights movement era, we must use more evolved, nuanced language about race. We must be better at our manipulation, and immediately labeling someone a racist because they said or did something racially offensive can oftentimes create more problems than it solves as a result of this fundamental misunderstanding. Given the country's brutal history of white supremacy, because, if you're new to this channel, the word supremacy means majority. White majority. And because the United States is a white majority country, that is a brutal history. All right. And racial violence. There's only racial violence in places like Cincinnati. The term racist typically conjures up the worst mental images. The term racist, there's associations with pictures that have been put into people's heads. Bull Connor ordering children to be hosed. Was there just children in that picture? I don't think so. I think there was all ages in that picture, but I'm sure that was just a publicity stunt. KKK members torching homes and churches. Did KKK members torch homes and churches, or was that another publicity stunt? White supremacists lynching men, women, and children and leaving their bodies hanging to terrorize the affirmative action community. There's never been an affirmative action community. There never will be an affirmative action community. They are probably the most disjointed group of people out there. But somebody being white majority or white supremacist, just rando grabbing people and stringing them up to trees, nobody does that. White people are the most justice-oriented, ordered people out of any race, and they don't go out, unless they got some mental issues, they don't go out and start killing people randomly because of whatever. If there was a criminal, society was much better because criminals were dealt with. And these days, criminals are not dealt with. Criminals are praised. As a result, for many, particularly within the white community, they consider those people the racists. Indeed, that stunted mental paradigm creates a good-bad binary, as Robin DiAngelo Berg, I think that's an MTF, explains in her New York Times bestseller White Fragility, why it's so hard to talk to white people about Waycism. Given this horrific context and the fact that most people have dreadfully low levels of racial literacy, humility, and stamina. Stamina? When someone is labeled racist. Yeah, because they don't want to tolerate it. It's stupid. For many, it's virtually impossible to not personalize that, and the urge to fight that characterization kicks in. Indeed, the view is that racists are bad, so we must prove that we are good, since our mental imagery around racism, again, the manipulation, mental imagery, and racist is typically centered around the worst behavior, lynching, slavery, overt subjugation. That extreme reference point creates an inability to see the much more common ways racism and racist behavior show up today. To make matters worse, if one is mentally repelling a characterization that they feel is unfair, it leaves little room for active listening, learning, and curious engagement. What's needed to engender real understanding and improvement. So basically, if you know that somebody is trying to manipulate you and you say, no, I'm not tolerating your BS, then they just get mad and say that you're a racist because they can't manipulate you. Arguably, the term racist is more appropriately used as an adjective describing specific behavior at a particular time instead of a noun branding a person for life. In this Yale News article, Waycism is about power and policy, not people, Dr. Ibrahim Kendi, author of the New York Times bestseller How to Be an Anti-Racist, explains. The term racist should instead be understood, and the thing moved a second here, as a descriptor. It literally describes what a person is being in any given moment based on what they are doing, saying, or not saying, not doing or not doing. That's ridiculous. This different interpretation of the term racist reminds me of an incident a few years ago with a good friend who happens to be a physician. As I watched an old episode of the Andy Griffith Show, he entered the room, glanced at the screen, and asked, "Is this the episode with the lady doctor?" To which I quickly responded, "Excuse me? Do you refer to yourself as a man doctor?" Having known him well for 15 years, I'd never before sensed even a scintilla of misogyny in his worldview, but in that particular moment, I felt his comment was not just offensive, but sexist. While I didn't label him a sexist, I told him that I thought it was a sexist comment. There's a difference. All right. So we started this article talking about Waycism, and this person has digressed to misogyny. What a nut. While an individual's racist comments, actions, and behaviors are certainly wrong and should absolutely be called out. Okay, Karen, thanks. It's also important to remember criminal defense attorney Stevenson's reminder that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. While most of us have told a lie or cheated at something at some point in our life, we likely rejected being characterized as a liar or a cheater for good reason, because a single act or deed doesn't define the totality of who we are as a person. Indeed, Bell Hooks surfaces this point with her poignant question: how do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? What do we do to people who won't accept, or who can't be brainwashed? Having grown up in a society defined by a racial caste system, virtually all of us will likely hold some racial biases, and those biases will impact our thinking, words, and actions from time to time. So I guess, you guys, we grew up in a socially defined racial caste system. That's news to me. It doesn't make us a bad person, it's just a natural outcome of our collective conditioning. For any naysayers who might doubt the prevalence of racial bias, consider taking Harvard's implicit association test. Your unconscious biases are bad, which is shown for decades, right, that most Americans have an automatic preference for white over affirmative action. It's important to note that the racial preferences or bias isn't exclusive to white people. I took the test twice, and both times I found a preference for European American over affirmative action American. My preference isn't born out of some character flaw in myself. It's a natural outcome of being born into a society that for nearly 350 years legally codified and socially reinforced a belief in white superiority. In a sense, it's quite liberating to realize that the biased or racist actions we may take or verbiage we may use isn't typically a result of our individual personal failings, but more realistically a natural outgrowth of our environment and conditioning. That in no way suggests we should accept it and move on with business as usual. You need to accept that there are 72 genders, but instead it should encourage us to stop focusing our attention on our own individual intentions and character and instead focus on addressing the continued narrative of racial difference and ameliorating the personal dire racial disparities and outcomes. A Yale News article quotes Kendi as saying, "For too long, society's understanding of racism has focused on the perpetrators rather than the victims. We should be outcome-centered and victim-centered. If a policy is leading to racial injustice, it doesn't really matter if the policymaker intended for that policy to lead to racial injustice. If an idea is suggesting that white people are superior, it doesn't really matter if the expressor of that idea intended for that idea to connote white superiority. If we train our focus on outcomes and victims, intention will become irrelevant." Part of the danger of using the term racist as a noun to label people instead of using it as an adjective to describe specific actions, behaviors, or policies is that it tends to individualize racism and fails to acknowledge the broad systemic reach and impact of racism. The truth is that racism is much like a cancer or pollution. So white people are like a cancer or pollution within society, impacting virtually everyone, not an evil only possessed by a few sinister individuals. Society is best poised to address racial disparities by seeking out and correcting racist policies, processes, institutions, and certainly the actions of certain individuals as well. Because things that are white supremacy are being on time to work, clocks, math, things like that. White supremacy. And let's see here. But there's a real understatement of the impact of racism when we focus too narrowly on specific individuals. An apt analogy is that struggle to lose weight. Many nutritionists recommend writing down everything that you eat to create awareness that will positively influence future choices. The focus on writing everything down isn't primarily to remind you of the obviously unhealthy foods as much as it is to acknowledge and highlight the cumulative, deleterious impact of the minor, less obvious, poor nutritional choices made throughout the day. Fatty salad dressing. What is this? This is stupid. They are much more likely to go unnoticed and unaccounted for. For obviously vile, overt individual racism still exists, and likely always will. Yeah, so if you point out the obvious, then you're a racist. So it's completely understandable that the term racist is used to label self-proclaimed white supremacists or similar actors, but most racism today manifests in a much more subtle and systemic way against white people. It's important to note that this shift away from labeling people as racist isn't suggested out of any attempt to minimize discomfort or hurt feelings. Oh, here we go. We're talking about feelings. While engendering individual discomfort or hurt feelings isn't the goal of calling out racism, it's important to acknowledge that the discomfort is often a natural part of the process of enlightenment and ultimate progress, just as soreness is part of adopting a healthy exercise regimen. Alrighty. To move forward, there must be relentless focus on prioritizing progress over discomfort, or as Dr. King referenced it in his famous letter from Birmingham jail, maintaining more devotion to justice than to order. Unfortunately, the outsized focus on feelings and comfort is a primary reason why there's been so little racial equity progress over the last several decades. So no, this isn't a call to, they want people to have interracial marriages and it just isn't working. So no, this isn't a call to avoid labeling people as racist, to simply spare white or other people's feelings, as it remains critically important to center white feelings and instead prioritize anti-racism progress. God, this is just a horrible article. Indeed, it's not just appropriate, but important to call out racist behavior when we see it or even when we do it ourselves. But let's also maintain relentless focus on outcomes and results. Waycism has indeed evolved. It does manifest and show up differently in 2022 than it did in 1922. It didn't exist in 1922. And if we're to have substantive, productive conversations about today's racism, we must be willing to adopt more precise and nuanced language that doesn't pick winners and losers, but instead recognizes racism as a common enemy. Okay, so here's a picture of Dana Brownlee. She's affirmative action. Bless her little affirmative action heart. All right, white people. This is Waycism in 3.0 in 2022. Their brainwashing isn't working and they're crying. They're stupid. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your thoughts below.